Well, welcome back. In this unit, we're going to be focused on Chapter 6 of Harmer, which is on teaching the language system. So you should have read Chapter 6 before watching this lecture, and if you haven't had a chance yet, please just stop the video, take a little time to read, and then come on back. On the previous day of class, we did a big overview looking at some of the particulars of the English language system, things like grammar, phonetics, parts of speech, collocations, language functions, and more. And today we're going to be looking at approaches to how to teach some of those specific aspects of English. So usually this is going to involve a sequence that looks something like that study, personalization, and activation we talked about earlier, or that PPP where we do present, practice, produce. In the study aspect of it, there's going to be an explanation of the form and the meaning of an aspect of language, and there's probably going to be some controlled practice and repetition. In personalization, we allow students to use the aspect of language that we're studying to talk about their lives, to personalize it in some way. And then in the activation phase, we hope that they can use whatever language they have to talk about what they want. So that will maybe integrate some of the aspect of the language that we're working on, but we don't limit them in the way we do during that controlled practice. When we're teaching specific aspects of language, one way we do this is through a deductive approach. So in a deductive approach, students are given the rules and then they apply those rules. Maybe it's something like a grammar structure. We give them the rules of the grammar and then we ask them to make phrases and sentences with those rules. So the example that we saw in the textbook was something like a teacher who is teaching the present continuous, and they maybe first engage students by talking about some activities that a person might do around their house, and then they show them a picture of a man who's painting a house, and he would say, he's painting the house, and then would isolate those parts to really draw attention to the form. So he is, maybe using his hands with he in one hand, is in the other hand. He is, he's, and bringing those hands together to show the contraction of he is into he's. So he's painting, again with the two hands, paint in one hand, ing in the other, painting, and drawing the hands together. He's painting the house. Students are asked to repeat the sentence, then they maybe move on to the next picture where we see he's fixing the roof, and they would follow a similar procedure with he's fixing the roof. He's fixing, he's fixing the roof, and so on. And then maybe the third picture is shown and students are asked, what is the man doing? To see if they can then produce the same form with he's mowing the lawn. Here we see the real engage, study, activate, sort of linear progression. Another approach is to teach language forms inductively. And so with an inductive approach, students are given examples of language, and then they try to work out the rules that are at play in the examples. So, for example, students might be given a text and then asked to find different examples of, for example, past tense in the text. And then looking at those examples of past tense, students are asked to say sort of how and why they are used in the ways that they are. And this can work really well for reading and listening tasks. It can work for having students find collocations using a learner's dictionary or a corpus. As I think I said before in an earlier lecture, this works especially well with maybe intermediate and advanced learners who already have a good bit of language to work with, to then be able to do some of that inductive work. Here we would be seeing kind of a more boomerang approach where we engage, we go straight into activation, we do some study, and then probably back to activation of reading the text again or a similar text to follow. An inductive approach does involve more cognitive effort in uncovering the patterns of language. And so some say that students learn more powerfully when they have to put in more of that heavy lifting in their learning. In the study phase, there are a variety of ways to clearly explain meaning. Often we do this by using realia. So if we want, especially working with a lot of content words, if you want students to understand what is a book, you can hold up a book. A map, hold up a map. A tea kettle, hold up the tea kettle, etc. We can also use pictures of those same items or pictures of sort of situations. If you want to talk about a person who has been swimming, sometimes showing a picture of a person who's wet or getting out of a pool can be helpful. We can also use a lot of miming when we're demonstrating doing particular actions, actually miming those actions, or using a lot of gestures. If we're teaching comparative and superlative adjectives, we can use our hands to show big, bigger, biggest. Often when working with things like verb tenses, it can be helpful to use timelines. So draw a line across the board, identify now on the timeline, and that can then be used to show things like events that happen over a certain period of time or different verb tenses that you would be working with. Sometimes if concepts or phrases are confusing, you can do a lot of describing. So the example in the textbook was if they come across a phrase like caring professions in a text, you could provide a list of examples of caring professions, things like doctors, nurses, social workers, etc. It's also helpful when explaining meaning to involve check questions. So if we're teaching something like conditionals, we can say something to our students like, if she missed the bus, she would be late for work. Did she miss the bus? Was she late for work? To see if students understand this concept. We can also, of course, utilize translation from the first language, but we have to be pretty careful with this because many words or phrases, or especially idioms, really have no one-to-one L1 equivalent in a lot of languages that translate well to English. Additionally, you'll have students from a wide variety of language backgrounds and you won't know all of their languages. So using translation is often not an especially helpful tool, but can be utilized well in some circumstances. There's also a variety of ways to explain language constructions. So sometimes using hand motions like I described with the example before, he with holding one hand out, is with the other hand out, and then bringing the hands together to show a contraction like he's, he is, he's, with bringing your hands together. When we're teaching something like stress, sometimes beating time with your hand through the syllables of a word can be helpful, and then exaggerating the stress with your hand on the syllable that gets the stress. Similarly, drawing intonation patterns with your hands in the air, so showing your hands go up when you're going up at the end of a question, or down at the end of a statement. Showing with your hand how it goes up and down can be very helpful in visualizing those patterns. Students like to see, sometimes, some students like to see a written explanation, maybe of something like if you're working with the conditional, seeing something like if plus had plus past participle leads to would plus have plus past participle. For some students, especially more advanced or perhaps older learners, actually benefit from being able to see that written out. It can also be helpful to use words on cards or on blocks that can be manipulated and moved around. That can be helpful in showing question formation. So you can write it as a statement first, she is going to the park, and then flip the subject and the auxiliary verb is and she. So you get, is she going to the park? And show students that pattern in that way so they can visually see how you flip those. Sometimes giving an explanation can be helpful. So for something like third person singular present simple, you might want to show or explain and show, look, with regular verbs, I, we, they, and you are the same. So I play, we play, they play, you play. But he, she, and it, we add the S. He plays, she plays, it plays. That can be really helpful for some students, but if you're explaining, it has to be a fairly simple explanation using language that students understand. Otherwise, this really can backfire and become more confusing to explain it in all the particulars this way. If we want new language items to move from the short-term memory to the long-term memory in our students, we really need to work with those forms and aspects of language again and again. So we need to explicitly bring back lessons into future practice that we do so that they can move from that short-term memory to the long-term memory. One way we do this is in our controlled practice. So by doing a lot of repetition. Sometimes it's choral repetition, so asking the whole class to repeat after me. That can be useful in controlled practice fairly early on in their learning a new form. Sometimes a semi-chorus, where you maybe break the students into two groups, have them reading or saying a dialogue together. Group one is person one, group two is person two in the dialogue, and they repeat in that way. It can sometimes be effective to nominate an individual student to repeat after you in front of the whole class, so everyone hears what that individual says. But sometimes actually just having everyone in the class quietly to themselves repeat back, where it's sort of a murmuring across the room. Everyone can kind of try out the new language form without feeling like everyone's listening to them and feeling kind of too vulnerable. It can be the case also with more advanced students who maybe have some understanding of the language form already, or they seem to have understood the explanation very well. You may get the sense that they don't need much controlled practice with them. So in that case, you might use freer practice. So eliciting a check of understanding. So if you've talked about the future aspect, you might just, instead of doing a lot of repeat after me, ask students, what are they going to do this weekend? And see if they can use the construction that you've just explained. So we'll look at a few examples from the textbook of teaching parts of the language system, including grammar, pronunciation, vocabulary, and language functions. The first one is teaching grammar, and the example from the book is one that involves some explain and practice procedure. So the teacher is choosing to teach present simple through habitual actions. They choose the theme of a marathon runner and her daily routine. So they start by engaging students, showing pictures of runners, asking if students like to run, getting them interested in the topic, and then they engage by then they go into study by showing pictures of that runner in her morning routine with a clock that shows the time of day. The idea that she does this routine every day. So she gets up at 5:30, and the teacher would really emphasize that verb, isolating it with that s ending. She gets up. She gets up at 5:30. She eats breakfast. She eats breakfast at 6 o'clock. And they would do some choral or individual repetition after saying several of the different things the runner is doing, maybe they would do some cue response, and she would say 5:30, and the students would respond, she gets up. 6 o'clock, she eats breakfast, etc. And then finally, in the activation, students maybe describe their own daily routine or the daily routine of another family member, and hopefully they're using that form that has just been taught to them. That last example was a deductive approach, teach the rule and the students apply it. But if you want to teach inductively, the second example in the text is for kind of an upper intermediate group that's learning about conditional if sentences, and they use more of a boomerang procedure in this approach. So the theme was grandparents, and they started by engaging, so asking parents what they think about grandmothers. Maybe they work in pairs, writing down adjectives that they would use to describe grandmothers. Then they go into the activation phase, where they read an excerpt from a story that involved a grandmother and her grandson. And then they go into the study session, where they are then looking through that text for sentences that have the word if. So they identify the sentences with if, and then they're asked to analyze them. Are they talking about a hypothetical situation? Are they talking about a future situation? What verb tenses are they using? And then after they've analyzed them, the students are asked to write sentences using those same patterns of hypothetical or future and the corresponding verb tenses. And then finally, in the return to an activation stage, maybe the students imagine a new situation with a grandmother. They write their own conversation that uses conditional ifs, and maybe then they role play that same conversation about a grandmother. In terms of teaching pronunciation, there are another number of things that we've got to make sure that we cover and keep in mind. One of those is intonation. So one way to teach that is by having students listen and analyze where they hear voices going up or going down and what that means. So the example in the text was of someone asking for a favor and the person responding, and the response might be just something like the word well, but based on whether the intonation goes up or down, we could guess at whether the person means yes or no. So if I'm asking you to come help me with the laundry and you say, well, that intonation is going down, that probably means no. But if you say, well, that intonation is going up, you probably are open to helping me out. Similarly with punctuation and its correspondence to intonation, you could pick a number of phrases that are not punctuated and ask students, based on either like an audio recording or you just reading out the phrases with intonation, they have to choose the correct punctuation to go with it. So something like, you want a pizza, if we say that with falling intonation, you want a pizza. You want a pizza. We know that's a statement. But something like, you want a pizza? You want a pizza? That rising intonation should clue them that you need a question mark there. Something like, you want a pizza? You want a pizza? That intonation tells them we need an exclamation mark. And similarly with a phrase like, you don't like my hat, you could do a very similar thing with punctuation and intonation. Also with teaching pronunciation, we have to work with our students on stress, so helping them find which syllable in a word, especially 3 and 4 syllable words, which one gets the stress. So it can be helpful to clap out the syllables and really exaggerate the stressed syllable when we clap it out. So syllable, they would hear that stress on the first syllable and put that in column A of the table you would provide them with. Something like exaggerate, exaggerate. They should be able to hear in that second syllable we have the stress. So this one would go in column D, etc. Things like songs and chants can be useful in teaching rhythm and the way that phrases and sentences tend to sound. The Wheels on the Bus was the example given in the textbook, and there are plenty of other songs that really teach natural sounding rhythm. There's also a very popular method known as jazz chants that can be used. Some think they are a little bit silly, but they can be quite effective, especially with younger audiences and some adults as well. So things like, I dropped into my neighborhood and what did I see? 100 happy faces smiling up at me. It's a little exaggerated, but that exaggeration helps you to hear where the intonation and the stress would typically be happening in terms of the rhythm. Also, when we work with pronunciation, often we do need to do some work on individual sounds or phonemes, and doing minimal pair exercises can be really useful for that, for using words that have one phoneme, just one phoneme that's different between them. So you might present students with two options, ship and sheep, and they would have to either circle one or the other based on what they hear, or maybe walk to one side of the room or the other based on what they hear. So if you read out, yesterday I saw a large sheep in the field, they would have to determine if they heard ship or sheep. Or being in love is so hard. Did you hear heart or hard? Sound and spelling exercises are really helpful because, as we've discussed, the correspondence between sound and spelling is not one-to-one in English. So maybe giving students a long list of words with OU and having them group those words with the ones that have the same sound. So rough and tough would go together, but ought and bought would go together, etc. And when students are having trouble or need to work on particular sounds, sometimes using tongue twisters that actually repeat the particular sound can be really helpful and in some ways fun, and bring a little bit of silliness to pronunciation work. When teaching vocabulary, there are some things that are better for some levels, and other things that are better for different levels. So when you're working with beginners, flashcards can be really useful, showing images and then having them learn the words based on that, or maybe showing images of people displaying emotions and learning adjectives or emotion words that way. For intermediate learners, sometimes things like vocabulary trees can be really useful. So like in the picture there, if we're working with the theme of a house and we want to elicit as much words around the theme of a house as possible, you could have them start drawing off branches to specific rooms, and then each specific room, the things they would find in those rooms. They should maybe work with partners or small groups, filling it out as extensively as they can. Maybe you do some pronunciation work or add words that are missing as you go around the room, working with each of those groups. For our advanced learners, sometimes having them do language research projects can be useful. So things like you could give them a list of words or phrases, perhaps like the example in the textbook, words or phrases related to weather, and then have them do some research to figure out which of those words and phrases, maybe they put them into a table from more severe weather to less severe weather, whether they're about precipitation or about wind or whatever the case might be. And then you have them read a text, maybe with weather phrases that are used as metaphors, like having a sunny disposition or showering someone with gifts. And based on their research, having them try to guess at what those phrases as metaphors might mean. Finally, it's important to teach students language functions, or how to use language to do things like inviting or apologizing or persuading. One way to do this is by modeling a dialogue. So the example in the text again of two characters, maybe drawing them up on the board, and just one of them saying to the other, "Would you like to come to the movies?" Break that down into pieces so that they're doing some kind of back-chained repetition. So come to the movies. Would you like to come to the movies? and then teaching them the appropriate response. So here we're teaching someone to invite, but then we also need to teach them whether they want to accept or decline the invitation, the appropriate way to do that as a language function. So something like, that would be great, would be great, that would be great, as an acceptance, or in the case of wanting to decline, I can't, or I'm afraid I can't, or sorry. Maybe you involve some cue response, so having them work in pairs on dialogues like these can be really helpful. And then maybe the students are asked to substitute other words to do a little bit of personalization. Would you like to come to dinner? Would you like to come to my house? Would you like to come for a walk? Giving them opportunity to use that same construction of a language function in personalized ways. It's also just really important to acknowledge that when you're learning a language, we make all sorts of mistakes. So knowing the kind of mistakes our students are going to make can sometimes influence how we will respond. The first kind of mistake is called a slip. So it's something that students can correct themselves once the error is pointed out to them. It's sort of like they already knew the right way to say it, but they forgot, or they got sloppy, or whatever. And if you sort of can clue them into it, they can self-correct. But then there's errors. So these are things that students can't actually correct themselves. They need explanation. They haven't fully integrated that form yet, and they need you to help them see what's gone wrong. There's also attempts where students are trying to say something they don't quite yet know how to say. And these are actually not really an error or a mistake. This is the kind of thing that we want to encourage, because learning a language necessarily implies risk-taking, and we want students to feel safe and free to do exactly that. There are a variety of reasons that students might make any one of these mistakes. One of them is that it could just be new information. They are still working on integrating the form and they haven't mastered it yet. Another one could be L1 interference, and we're going to talk about that more extensively on tomorrow on day 7. But things like maybe their language doesn't have articles, or grammatical constructions are different, or their alphabet or writing system is different. And there are things that are transferring from their first language into the second language that are incorrect. It might be false friends, or things that we assume are cognates between our first language and our second language, which are actually not. The classic example of that is embarrassed in English and embarazada in Spanish, which of course doesn't mean embarrassed but means pregnant. Things like that abound. We call those false friends. And then there are actually something called developmental errors, which these are just things that occur naturally as a language develops, and so they're sort of sensible assumptions, but that are false. Like putting ed endings on verbs that are actually irregular and they have a different past tense form. That's a normal developmental thing that L2 learners will do. So when considering how to respond to those kinds of mistakes, it's really important to consider when are the errors happening. So if errors are happening during things like role plays or conversations, correcting in the middle of those really interrupts the flow of communication. It can inhibit students during that activation stage. It's really much better to come back to those mistakes later, especially if they're impeding communication, or if they are sort of repeated again and again. That's something you can bring back after. But if errors are happening during study sessions where you're really doing those, that kind of study or controlled practice, that's a time when you can correct those errors without interrupting the flow. We have to really always remember, though, that when we're correcting, we have to be gentle. We got to consider the feelings of our students and avoid at all costs humiliating them. We want to maintain a classroom culture where mistakes are normal, mistakes are welcome, students can feel comfortable taking risks. And as teachers, we can model this by being really gentle and humorous with ourselves when we make mistakes of different kinds in the classroom. Show that that's normal and it's okay. One way to correct a mistake gently might be to point out the error with an echo and a different intonation. So if your student says, I goed to the store, you can return to them, you goed to the store? And see if they can self-correct. Oh no, I went to the store. But if they can't, if you return it with I goed to the store, and they look at you blankly, sometimes it can be appropriate to draw in a peer and see if they can help their student out. So asking the next student, did he go to the store? And perhaps they can answer then, no, he went to the store. You really have to kind of feel that out and see if that's something that would feel okay to the student who's making the error. And if you sense that that wouldn't be welcome, it's better for you to just offer them the correct form. You didn't go to the store, you went to the store. And that is what we have for today on day 6. So your next step should be to go ahead and look at the task list for day 6. Make sure you understand all the details for your activities today and get going on those. Look forward to seeing you next time.